All right, we're trying to stay right on time if we can. This is the program here, a little speed dating as we go through our morning. And I wanted to ask that last AI question as a setup to really talk to Rodney and to Bartley on sort of what we're doing about AI security and what the companies that they see are doing. So I'm really I'm really excited to talk AI for really the first time in a cyber 360. I mean, last time it was kind of woven into every other section we've had, and we kind of broke it out this year to really talk through. So, Rodney Zemmel, thank you so much for joining. Senior partner, global leader at McKinsey. I noticed you were about 30 years at McKinsey, and that's quite a career. Congratulations on that. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, and I'm sort of amazed that you say it's like a novelty for you to be talking about AI. I feel like it's all I've done for the last year and a half is talked about AI. So it
It
is.
feels like 7 years in 1 year right now as we talk about purely AI. I'm the same way. It feels like a long time, but I go back to my last couple of State of Cyber. It was coming, but like now it's here, and it's obvious that it's a much more forefront. But
It is well and truly here, right? So I'll probably have more to say on the opportunity side than on the threat side, right? But since your first question is a threat question, I think I'd start by saying, look, what doesn't work is just pulling up the drawbridge, right? I think, this time last year, there were lots of companies who were saying, let's ban the use of any of the generative AI apps on work devices. Let's not, let's wait and see and so on. That largely hasn't worked, right? Either for the companies or the countries who are trying to follow those strategies. So instead, you've got to keep moving, right? And I think you've got to take the risks and pass them. Some of them have technological solutions, right? So early on, there was a lot of worry about how is your data going to leak to the outside world, right? There are clear technological solutions to build one-way valves to stop that. And some of them have human solutions, right? There's a lot of discussion around hallucination and so on. We can debate whether hallucination is a feature or a bug, but the right combination of human in the loop checking, the right combination of how you tune the model, and then the right combination of AI checking AI before you have the human in the loop checking is how you address those sorts of threats. So you got to keep moving, and you got to pass the threats into what are human issues versus what are technology plus human issues.
yeah, I can't agree more, Rodney. And I'll come back to you. I want to talk more about that opportunity area with you because I know you oversee that big digital practice at McKinsey and doing a lot of strategies around that. But I want to bring Bartley into this conversation. Thank you. Why do you have such a menacing looking picture? I got to have you turn on your video and make you smile for a minute, Bartley, if I can. Are you on there? Where are you? I see you now. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Great to see you. Thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate having you here. Congrats on your amazing career as well. I think you're quite a few years now at NVIDIA as well. And I had a chance just last week to hear Jensen talk a lot about the future of AI at a big conference and had a chance to chat with him. And I know you're a big part of that in building Morpheus and building Rapids and components of that. We just spend a second, Bartley, and just talk a little bit about NVIDIA and its approach to cyber. And for those who don't know Morpheus and Rapids, just give us a minute or two on what it is, because it's an important foundation of a lot of cyber.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Dave, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm going to write down that may be the first time I've ever been called menacing. So I'm going to note it. And I'm going to refer back to it. Fantastic. No, it's been great, and definitely you heard from the expert, right, on AI when you talked with Jensen at NVIDIA. We're obviously, I'll lead by saying, I'm fairly biased. We are big believers in AI. We're big believers in what it can do for every industry, and specifically for cybersecurity. We take when we're engineering and when we're coming up with some of the toolkits and SDKs you mentioned, like Rapids and Morpheus. And for everything we do, we generally take a first principles approach, right? And that's an engineering term where we look at what's the core problem here. And when we think cyber, especially now and going into the future, and even for the past few years, we're thinking data. We're thinking massive amounts of data, and how are we making use of this kind of dark data or data that people aren't even thinking about for cybersecurity right now? How can you keep up with those velocities? How can you integrate that? And especially as we'll talk about, AI gets more and more sophisticated. How are you using it in those modalities? And when you look at things like Rapids, which is, if you're not familiar, it's our open source GPU accelerated data science stacks, right? Which are providing data ingest capabilities and data frame manipulations and machine learning capabilities. And there's also parts of Rapids that are underpinning new technologies that we're seeing with LLMs and vector databases. So like accelerating the vector and the similarity searches for there. And then Morpheus specifically built on top of that layer of Rapids with some other things to help really accelerate those pipelines and those use cases for the cybersecurity ISVs, making it super easy to plug into your data feeds, mix and match modules, and really get started. Another great way of summing all that up is you don't have to be a CUDA or a GPU programming expert anymore, right? You can work in Python. We want you to come where you're at, and you can work in Python, or if you love C++, you can work in that too, and you can now be the expert.
By the way, I love the way you said that because that almost goes back to my engineering days there. So appreciate you. And by the way, it's just amazing. I just got to call out NVIDIA here for thinking about designing security in from almost day one. And that is pretty rare when you look at it from our cyber lenses that we all have, where most of the vendors rush out an IoT product, a car, a plane, or something, and oops, we got to go put security into it. And it's just really refreshing to hear all the engineering and all the ground up effort that NVIDIA has done to build a platform, not just an accelerated compute platform, but security baked in at every layer. And I know we got a lot to go and there's risks there as well, but it's really refreshing to see that from my vantage point a lot of years. But I want to come back to Rodney for a minute and talk more opportunity. Then I want to hear Bartley's view on this too. What did we hear from CISOs? What did we hear from human automation, right? They have a lot of vendors, and how do we begin to use AI to automate these cyber problems and opportunities because they're getting a vulnerability 100 times a day? How do you create efficiency to your SOC, and what can we do to begin to leverage AI for good and an opportunity? So over to you for a minute. Maybe help us look to cyber from an opportunity perspective to help CISOs and help this market with AI.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start by saying, look, one of the biggest challenges with the whole generative AI boom of last year is there's a bit of a risk that it sends us back to 2018 in digital, where it's like death by 1,000 pilots, right? It's like the easiest technology to go and fire something up and show some cool little results within 2 or 3 days. But you're not actually going to get enterprise scale impact from that. And you're going to add a whole lot of risk and possibly a whole lot of tech debt across the organization in doing those things. So I think the first thing is like actually taking a focused approach to where the value is, right? Where are these new technologies actually going to help companies make more money? And therefore, where should you concentrate efforts? And therefore, where should CISOs be concentrating defenses? And what we're seeing, and sorry, I'll go a little broader than your question, if that's okay. What we're seeing is if you take generative AI specifically, we're helping about 300 companies at this point actually build enterprise approaches in Gen AI. And like what really like delivering value probably falls into 4 categories. And I'll just say them quickly and happy to click down into more detail into any of them as helpful. So first of all, just everything to do with customer journeys, right? So if you have a call center, if you have web-based customer service, anything like that, Gen AI is going to do it better. So that's the first area many companies are going after. The second area is concision, right? So anything that's about creating virtual experts, right? So concision is concise plus precision. And this has all kinds of CISO challenges because it's very easy to say, I don't know, what's the world market for paper clips or something, and you'll get the answer on your phone in seconds. That only becomes useful when you can combine that with your company's own proprietary data in a way that actually understands context. So it knows what's important and what's from a thought leader in your organization versus what's just some random email. And how you do that context engineering, right, gets quite tough. But if you can do that well, you can create amazing virtual expert opportunities. And we're seeing that in everything from, heavy equipment in the mining industry to how do you train teenagers how to use the ice cream machine in fast food to how do you train lawyers so the second-year attorney has access to the same level of expertise as the 10-year partner. So the concision, that's the second one. The third, of course, is coding, right? How do you use this actually in the software development process? And what we're seeing here is if you just give people the tools out of the box, you get about a 10 or 20% increase in software productivity, recognizing that's a hard thing to measure. If you actually build training routines on top of it, then we can see a 50 to 75% increase. So there's a big productivity argument for really building this into your training routines. And of course, there's a safety and security argument there as well, right? So I think those two vectors will work together. And then the third is creative content, right? So whether it's personalized marketing or whether it's generative video content and so on, but creative content will be the fourth C, where we're seeing real opportunity in what's being deployed here.
I like the way you taught me a new word, concision. I'm gonna start using that. So I like that.
It's funny you say that. It's actually a personal goal to get that into the dictionary for this year, right? I think we made it up last year.
Yeah, I got it. I wrote that one down for sure. Bartley, over to you for a minute on opportunity, because again, you've been an engineer near NVIDIA, you've been building these platforms and obviously creating opportunity for the cyber ecosystem around NVIDIA. Maybe just talk for a little bit, what opportunities you see product vendors as they maybe move from CPU to GPU models, but also the platform, and just help us craft that for this community, if you would.
Yeah, sure. I think there's I also wrote down that word. I'm going to help you on your goal, Rodney. I'm going to help you.
You're not menacing at all.
I did. It's been the whole time. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there, again, there's a wealth and there's a whole spectrum of opportunity. We see some of it, and this is a big personal belief, right? I'm a big believer in the right tool for the right job, right? I grew up on a farm in the middle of Ohio. And that was instilled in me from a very young age, right? Like, it's the right tool for the right job. And that's true of what we're doing today, right? And so what I tell our engineers, if I can solve a problem by counting things really, really quickly at scale, I'm going to count things really, really quickly at scale. If I can solve the problem with machine learning models or even regressions, I'm going to do that. If I need deep learning, I'm going to do that. If I need LLMs and something even more powerful, I'm going to do that. And that should all be in the toolbox. And so when we look at the suite of kind of capabilities, I think a lot of this and the opportunities, a lot of us are familiar with large language models, right? Like, thank you, ChatGPT, thank you, Microsoft, right, for bringing this right to the forefront of all of our discussions. And I think there's a ton of opportunities there. We can talk about cyber-specific foundation models and the work that's doing there. Like, how do you take something that's really designed around natural languages, English language, Spanish language, all types of languages, and adapt that for something that, if you squint, really looks like natural language, but doesn't behave to the semantics and the syntax of natural language. And there's different relationships there. So there's that whole possibility. We can train up these foundation models that have the same power as natural language models, but outperform, and do very well on highly specific tasks. Look at synthetic data generation to solve a data gap, right? Your red teams are overworked. It takes a really long time to plan operations. It takes even longer if you have to spin up external infrastructure to do this, right? And this is a human intensive process. We can train foundation models not to generate the attacks, but to generate authentic looking telemetry from those attacks. We can perform these scenarios at incredible speed, still keeping the human, right? We're not getting rid of the human. The human still has to plan what to do, and they have to execute it with the correct prompts and choose the right models, and they have to interpret the results when we're back. But they might not need to go out and spin up external infrastructure or do all this coordination to make it happen, shortening the amount of time that it takes to do these types of operations. But then you go throughout the entire stack and you see these problems that I alluded to earlier. How are you going to scale your data ingest? These large language models and even machine learning models need more and more data to be more accurate. How do you scale that while also, keeping an eye towards your TCO or towards energy consumption, right? Which is a big thing that we should all think about. And those are all areas where GPU computing can really help. CPU is really great. If I need something that executes sequentially and I need the ultimate multitasker, CPU architecture is great, right? And we love CPU architecture, and we even have Grace, right, which is our very first CPU. When you need something that can take a task and multiply it times 10,000 or 30,000, right, and do all of those tasks at the same time extremely quickly, that's where a GPU is magnificent and able to do this. So we can break up what cybersecurity pipelines are doing on ingest, on modeling, on data collection, and on the LLM side, and push those and scale those out on the GPU. And that's what our SDKs and our APIs really are built to do.
By the way, I can't agree more with what you're saying. My theme at NightDragon from an investment point of view for the last quite a few years was, I called it crowd, cloud, and AI, right? So the idea for cyber to really have an underpinning of machine learning and AI, but also, leveraging hyperscalers and, virality of hyperscalers, but the power of the crowd in the world of cyber is enormous. So the more data you can ingest, the more powerful your crowd can become, the faster you can respond. It just becomes the foundational components. NVIDIA's created those ways now to really create massive ingestion of data, doing that at scale, both on open source and exquisite intelligence models to really create faster response. And at the end of the day, that's what we got to do. Can I flip it around maybe to you, Rodney, for a minute? I wanted to be optimistic in the first part of this panel, but talk about the threats. You heard this, like, coming out of the World Economic Forum and Davos, what was the number one threat that came out of it? Misinformation, disinformation, generative AI, creating a power that could create influence operations. We have 64 countries with democracy up for grabs, 4 billion people kind of, at stake with that. And misinformation, disinformation is our biggest challenge. And we have very little ways of detecting deep fakes, solving that problem. And this whole idea of narrative intelligence, where we can begin to take everything that Bartley and team and NVIDIA have been building and start to understand deep fakes and narratives and try to prevent that from happening. It's a race against the clock because of what's going on. I'd be curious, as you look at the threat side of this problem, what do you see as things that we have to do? And the last thing I'll comment there, the 50 billion of investment that went into AI and only a couple $100 million into securing AI, kind of a problem we got to catch up to. So talk about the threat side first, Rodney, if you would, just from your perspective, and what do we got to do about that?
Sure. So, listen, there's no doubt that the fakes and deep fakes problem is an enormous one, right? And it's certainly the one that has got all the headlines and people are making the TV specials about and so on. I think, again, you got to pass this into technological solutions and human solutions, right? I think we're going to see an arms race of technological solutions around fake detection, right? And whether it's watermarking or whether it's, whatever your favorite technology is, to see if something is real or AI generated and if it's primary or manipulated. And I think truly we're going to see an arms race there. I'm actually not that optimistic that there is going to be a technological approach there that can solve that problem and stay permanently ahead, right? I think it's going to be, frankly, a little bit like where we are in cyber, where somebody comes up with a new defensive innovation that's overcome then by an offensive innovation, you get the ratchet effect. So the human side of it then is, I actually think in sort of an ironic way, given what's happened to the sort of the news media over the past 20 years, is right, source is actually going to matter a lot more, right? And people are going to look at where's the information actually coming from, and you're going to trust the source of the content as an important component of the content itself, right? So who is saying it is going to become as important as what is being said, right? So that's the human side of the sort of the fake and deep fake problem. I would though like to add, I think there's two other things that I think are just as scary as the deep fake problem, but aren't getting quite the same headlines. They're not being ignored, but they're not getting the same headlines. The first is sort of the power of persuasion, right? I think what these technologies can do to persuade people to do things, right, is pretty scary. I mean, obviously used with integrity, right? It's an incredibly successful sales tool for companies, right? Or even just for the human benefits in it. I'm struck by, there was a study over the summer from the UK where a group of academics were trying to see if people were texting back and forth with a doctor and whether they could tell the difference to whether it was a real doctor or whether it was, I think, GPT 3.5. And it turns out the patients could tell the difference, right? Even pretty elderly patients, more than 70% of the time, knew if it was a doctor who was texting them or if it was the chatbot. But they then asked, which one did you prefer, right? They overwhelmingly preferred the chatbot to the real doctor, right? They thought it was more informative and they thought it was more empathetic, right? So, like, it's easy to turn that into a joke about doctors, right? Or even maybe British doctors more specifically. But I think where it goes is how powerful this technology is going to be for engaging people, right? And for having conversations that people actually value. And there's huge force for good there. but obviously there's real force for evil there as well. And that's a different than the deepfake issue. The last one that I'll pause is just attacks on the AI itself, right? So what you can do with with sort of inappropriate prompting, right? To spoil to sort of spoil the data, right? Or to really sort of shut these systems down with malicious prompting, I think is a whole other piece that needs to be thought about from a security standpoint.
Yeah, well said. I like the way you framed the three, by the way. And coming back to that source of content for a minute, I thought was fascinating. We watched the New Hampshire primaries. I'm sure you all saw the Biden robocalling situation, with a deep fake. And, of course, people thought the source was actually President Biden. And so, we have to get literacy up here as well, to your point of the persuasion. And in the military circles, we call it cognitive warfare, psychological warfare, persuasion warfare, that we're watching happening around the world. And now with these powerful tools that we have in the hands of the wrong people, that area of cognitive warfare, persuasion becomes even more magnified, and that source and reputation score of the source becomes even more important to that equation, Rodney, in my opinion. Maybe partly over to you. I'm curious because you live inside this every day, and I love what you said about opportunity, but just maybe help us educate us on the threat from your perspective.
Yeah, so I agree with Rodney on everything that he said, right? I do think it is, in my view, the way I think about this is not a net new, right? Threat net totally. It is another layer, right? That we talk about. We often talk security classic, we talk security in layers, right? Where it's not one thing that you're doing, it's all of these things that you're doing. And certainly education is a part of it. And additionally, I read a lot of things, and also my wife is a college professor. So you read a lot of things about, are colleges going to ban things like cyber GPT, and they're going to ban these for these types of things. I think that is, in my opinion, a bit of a missed opportunity, right? Because when we're talking about literacy and we're talking about responsible use, yes, we have to do that with current generations and everyone in the workforce today, right? And it's going to be a massive lift. We also have an opportunity to introduce this as another tool, as the word processor of 2024, right? And if we can instill that responsible use of that, I think that's another vector into it, where we can not only say, hey, here's how you use it and where you use it. It's the same way where we teach students how to use appropriate sources, right? We need to expand on that and add this other lens into it. But then the other parts are, I always go back to, we had this conversation with a number of companies that we're either working for or systems integrators, and then also just internally, where they're like, okay, how are we securing our AI against prompt injections or poisoning or all these other types of things? Very important, right? We should do that. And we talk about that. But my other questions are you doing all of the fundamentals that we as an industry would recommend that you do, right? Over the years, show me what you're doing for rules-based access controls, right? We've come into situations where people are worried about reverse engineering the data out of a model, but it doesn't matter because the data used to train that model is sitting on a wide open S3 bucket, right, to the world. And so I'm not going to go to this model and get your data. I'm going to go to this S3 bucket and just pull the data down, right? And then, if we're talking about things you can do today that exist today, if you have that AI model and you're interested, let's say you're doing all of the basics, you've got all of your rules, all of your stuff is locked down, you have all the policies in place, doing the simple things like hashing your model and digitally signing that model and comparing that against that, right, in production gets you really far, right? I think we would be surprised about the number of things that are not doing this, and we just add layers onto it. And so there will always be those new threats, and we saw it, like you mentioned, Dave, with the Biden robocalls, and we saw it, in other areas. I think about the X, Twitter, and Taylor Swift, right? And there's all of these things happening right now. And those are important. But if we're not doing these fundamentals, if we're not doing these foundations, I think it's a real missed opportunity. And the last thing I'll say about it is, we talk a lot about AI, and I love AI. But my general take on AI is we call it AI, until we really trust it, right? As soon as we really trust it, do you know what it becomes? Automation, right? As soon as we trust something, it stops becoming AI and it becomes this automation. We think about all the things that exist today that we use every day. I think there's a point in time where spell checking and grammar and Grammarly, we would have thought about that as AI if we have the same context that we do today, right? But now it's this suite of automation. So a lot of what I think positioning, it's like, how do we take AI and really make that so reliable? And it's all the things Rodney mentioned, right? To really push that towards, well, that's automation for you, person.
Bartley, I'm changing my whole look on you. Grew up on an Ohio farm, wife's a professor, you're the nicest guy in the world, you're the smartest guy in the world. And all right, I'm gonna come up with a new one for you. But I really think you hit on something that I really believe in. Like, we have to teach the world hygiene and foundations of AI, right? Because if we don't get the hygiene right first, we're going to have problems later. And I don't think that education's fully out there. The literacy of what to do. You mentioned, like, just rules-based access and all the permutations of access and how to manage policies related to that and getting your foundation right, or else you are going to have poisoning, you're going to have hallucination, you're going to have other problems. And at some point, maybe we can partner on how to really get education out there on hygiene and foundation and visibility to get your stack right to start. Let me stay with you for 1 second, then I'm going to Rodney to end this thing. I heard Jensen say something that was mind-boggling last week, just talking about how Moore's law has changed with accelerated compute. And I might not get these numbers exactly right, but when you start to think about Moore's law taking 10 years to get 100 times kind of growth, and now accelerated compute by NVIDIA adding a couple zeros, and he even mentioned AI doubling every 6 months in power. It's really interesting to watch the speed and inertia that this technology platform is creating for us all, which is an exciting opportunity. Maybe just comment about the future here for a minute, Bartley, if you would, and kind of what do you see in a year in 2024 as kind of, where this thing is all going?
Yeah, it's, that's true. We there's a lot of charts on there, and Jensen obviously says it's the best out of any of us. I see that acceleration continuing as new architectures are available, as NVIDIA specifically brings other types of architectures. We talk about our CPU architectures, and then we haven't even broached the subject of architectures for NICs and Ethernet, right? If we look at like the data processing unit and what can be offloaded from host onto something like the DPU. So it's a collection, right? It's not just GPU anymore, it's DPU, it's these ARM-based, CPUs that we're talking about. I see acceleration there, obviously. I also think that, and this is my personal opinion, NVIDIA software historically has not been the easiest software to use, right? Let's look at CUDA. It's very powerful, but it does take a CUDA expert to do it. And so that's why I think it's really important that we come up with and we continue investing in much more user-friendly, not just SDKs, but APIs that people can take, and they can take that API and they can run that in their own infrastructure, they can run it in our infrastructure. So I think all of this acceleration will continue. I think using that AI, Dave, like you mentioned, doing the foundations well and making sure that's there, we can turn AI on that problem too, right? We can have systems, and we're working on this right now, that are going off and making sure, like, this policy was updated. Ask the question to your integrated event-driven chatbot, am I in the best possible configuration state still, right? And have that information for the human, right? So you can use it to help you do the fundamentals. Those don't need to be disjoint.
Thank you, Bartley. Awesome. Rodney, bring us home with any last comments on the future and what you're excited about going forward.
Yeah, so listen, I think we can get very carried away with how much more powerful the models are going to get, right? I think the models' power already massively outpaces the power of most humans to use them, right? Like, we've given everybody these, like, super refined racehorses, and most people are still figuring out how to put on their riding boots, right? What we find is when we're helping companies really build things that are going to work at scale across an enterprise, the model itself, it's about 15% of the total effort, right? 85% of the effort and the cost goes in the context engineering, the prompt engineering, all the upstream pre-processing, all the downstream, ML ops and so on that you need to build out. So I think we're going to move in 2024. This is hopefully going to be the year of really getting value at scale from AI. And that's going to be defined by two things. First of all, enough of this like bottom-up use case prioritization, right? Most companies that did that are still struggling to find real value. Instead, you've got to take a big piece of your business, a domain, and do a top-down sort of how do you actually think about where the value is and how do you do things fundamentally different in one area of the business rather than sprinkle a whole bunch of use cases thinly. So that's thing one. Thing two is you actually need to think about how do you create the real enterprise solution that will have generative AI as a little bit in the middle of it, but how do you build out the rest before and after that to make something that's really going to be a scalable and safe platform across your enterprise? And we've had way too much focus on, which is the best, micro features of the model versus how do you build something that really can scale properly and can support real change in the business. So maybe not the answer you were looking for, because I think the technology is already way more than we can use it for. Now it's time for business to catch up.
All right. Well, every year from here on out, we're going to have our own section on AI and how it meets cyber and the rest of the world. So, Rodney, thank you. Really appreciate your comments. And Bartley, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate everything you do for the community as well. Gentlemen, thank you and have a wonderful day. Appreciate your comments.
See you both next year then. Great.
Thank you. Same time next year.
Or sooner.